fashioned. Got to go for the old stuff.
Ah.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if all of you would mute your mics, I guess I could mute all of them. Do that. Like that. We're going to go ahead and get started. I hope you can still hear me. All right. Probably most of you know me. My name is Chuck Gates. I run the Prineville Bird Club, and this is the monthly Prineville Bird Club meeting where we'll take care of a little bit of business, but mostly we're going to be talking about the local Central Oregon Blackbirds today. A little bit of information about how to identify them, and also a little bit about where to look for them, and some tidbits and information that I picked up online about each one of those blackbird species. Some of them you may not even have realized that were blackbirds. Anyway, this is the Prineville Bird Club. The Prineville Bird Club in normal times met the second Thursday of every month. We would meet at the Cook County Library in Prineville. Doors would open at 6:30 in the evening, and we would have a half-hour social hour, and then the presentation would start at 7 o'clock. Then typical night, we would have a little bit of news where we would ask people about what they're seeing and locally as far as birds go. Then we would share some local bird photographer photos. And then there may be some other kind of business. We would talk about our monthly field trip that we used to take that we're going to get back into this spring, we hope. And then we would have an hour-long or hour-so-long program on some kind of bird species, or somebody took a trip to Afghanistan and they took a bunch of bird pictures. We would just have some kind of a program that's was bird related anyway. So that's what we used to do before COVID. That's what we hope to do when COVID goes away eventually. We hope COVID goes away eventually. We're going to try to ease back into that starting next month. It's my plan to go from Zoom meetings this month in March to a sort of a modified in-person meeting at the Cook County Library next month. So next month, the second Thursday of the month, we will have an in-person meeting. We're going to take some precautions at that meeting. We're going to have people sitting quite a ways away from each other. We're going to have people, we're going to ask people when they socialize to try to keep some distancing. We're going to ask that people mask up if they feel uncomfortable not going without a mask. We're going to ask that people are vaccinated. And if they're not vaccinated, we're going to ask that they don't come. That's a little bit harsh for some people, and they maybe will ruffle some feathers, but we have to be a little bit careful as we ease back into this non-COVID environment that hopefully will happen one of these days. So look for some information about that on COBOL and on the Prineville Bird Club Facebook page. I don't think everyone knows this. There's actually a brand new East Cascades Audubon Society Facebook page. If you're a Facebook person, you can just search East Cascades Audubon Society on the Facebook page, and it will come right up. We had a Facebook page for a lot of years. No one ever used it. It was very awkward to use and difficult, and people couldn't post their own pictures and things like that. Now we have a Facebook group, which is much easier to use. And individuals, once you join the group anyway, you can post questions. You can get announcements, like there are announcements for this meeting. You can get information. You can chat with other birders that are local. You can post pictures that you have taken and say, you know, what kind of bird is this? Or ask people, have you seen one of these? Or you can enter into discussions. People have discussions on identifications. They have discussion on some ethical issues even. There are rules to the page, so you'd want to read that. And we ask that you read those rules when you do sign up. But the whole thing's pretty structured pretty well, and I think it's designed to be very entertaining for local birders. And we have about 125 members right now that have signed up. We're shooting for 500, and we'll probably get that, we hope, in a year's time or so. And we have our own little Central Oregon social media universe that we can be involved with anyway. So again, that's the East Cascades Audubon Society. The Prineville Bird Club has the same thing. It's just not quite as big. We only have about 75 members in the Prineville Bird Club Facebook page. But still, people post there quite often. And if you are a Prineville person, or if you're a member of the Prineville Bird Club, or if you just want to, if you're interested in birds in this area, then feel free to join the Prineville Bird Club Facebook page as well. I mentioned before that we had monthly field trips associated with the Prineville Bird Club. We're going to get back into doing that again, probably not in April. Probably we'll start in May, but we'll have to wait and see. Right now, we already have 2 field trips scheduled per month in the months of May, June, July, August, September, and I think October. And those 2 field trips are at the Crooked River wetlands that the Prineville Bird Clubs are sponsoring. So we already have 2 field trips a month, which is difficult to schedule that many trips. We're adding another one for the Prineville Bird Club will be difficult, but we're going to do it. We want to get away from the Crooked River wetlands and expand out into other parts of Crook County and other parts of Central Oregon. So we're going to do it. It's just going to take a lot of work and help and planning. And members of the Bird Club have been really good about stepping forward and helping out so far. So look for those announcements about field trips out into Crook County and to other parts of Oregon. If you have questions today, I would suggest that you sort of jot them down or make a note somewhere where you can ask those questions. You can use the chat function of this of the Zoom program and just chat down, jot down a question. Maybe we'll look at those at the end, but we probably won't interrupt the presentation to ask questions. Instead, if we could just have those questions at the end, and we'll try to deal with them one at a time, or if you just have any comments or anything like that. And it doesn't have to be Blackbird or oriented. If you have a question about something else, that's okay. We can deal with that too. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started, unless anybody has anything else to add. What am I forgetting? I'm probably forgetting something. We'll just go ahead and jump right into the program tonight on the Icterids, or the Blackbird family. So give me a second, I'll set up my screen and we'll take a look at some Blackbirds. Okay. Can everybody see that? Should say in orange and black letters and white letters on orange and black background. It says Blackbirds in Central Oregon. Nod your head like this if you can see it. Good. Okay. Looks good. Thanks, Bob. Okay, we're going to take a look at the Blackbirds and Blackbird family. The Blackbirds belong to the family Icteridae, or the Icterids. So you'll hear me use that term quite a bit today, the Icterids. It's not a term that most people are commonly aware of anyway, but it's a bird that's used quite a bit in birding circles anyway, and it belongs to a family of birds that are New World birds for the most part, not found in the Old World back in the Eastern Hemisphere anyway, but found over here in the West, found in North and South America. You can find them almost from the tip of North to almost the tip of South, but in the colder parts on both ends, they're not very particularly common. They are unrelated to the Old World birds that are also called Blackbirds. You might be a Beatles fan. There's a Blackbird song about blackbirds singing in the dead of night that Paul McCartney sings, and they're referring to a different kind of bird, more of a thrush bird that sings at night. It's not a true blackbird, not an Icterid like we have here anyway. There are about 100 species of these Icterids that are found in the tropics and here in the cooler parts of the North and South America anyway. Those 100 species are typically caciques, oropendulas, and troupials, which are birds that are found more in the tropics anyway. And then the birds that are found out here in the temperate climates are birds like blackbirds and meadowlarks and orioles and cowbirds, and maybe a couple other that I'm not thinking of. Most of them are black, and they show some kind of red or yellow, and that's why we call them blackbirds. Some of them have a bit of a metallic sheen to them, and as a group, they're pretty sexually dimorphic. And if you don't know that term, it means that the males and the females are quite a bit different from each other. Often they're different sizes, and often they're different colors. In some cases, they even behave in different ways. In a couple of instances today, we'll talk about the fact that some blackbirds, when they migrate separately. The males will go one place, the females will go to another place. So there's a lot of the dimorphism going on. Dimorphism means two forms. There's two forms of behavior here. One goes north, one goes south, or two forms of color. One of them is yellow and one of them is black, that kind of thing. So when we talk about sexual dimorphism in the presentation, what we're talking about is that the boys and the girls don't look the same. One of the characteristics that this group shows is that they have the ability to use their gaping muscles. Now, most of you are pretty aware that passerines or perching birds are pretty good at chomping down on things. They have pretty good muscles for biting down and cracking open seeds or breaking the shells of insects and things like that. But most of the passerines are pretty bad at opening their mouth. The muscles that are involved in opening the mouth are quite weak. Well, the icterids are actually pretty good. They have pretty strong gaping muscles for opening their mouths. So they have the ability to take their mouth and jam it into some freshly thawed soil and open the mouth and create a sort of a chasm there that will allow them to feed on some of the invertebrates that have crawled up into that space of thawed dirt right on the surface. So this is why you often see icterids, the blackbirds. You often see them out in a field somewhere, and you might be thinking, well, they're out in the field feeding on seeds. But if you look at them carefully, the icterids that we have, the blackbirds that we have, will often be out in those fields, and they're out in a grass field or out in a pasture where there won't be a whole lot of seed. There may be some wild windborne seeds out there, but there's not a lot of grain seeds out there for them to feed on. That's not what they're feeding on. They will feed on seed if it's out there, but they may be out there using those gaping muscles to jam into the newly thawed, just the first quarter inch or so or half inch of soil, and feed on the invertebrates that are found in just that little part of soil. Gives them an advantage over some of the other passerines, and that's one of the reasons why these are fairly numerous birds, the icterids, the blackbirds. Icterid comes from a Greek word icteros, which means the jaundiced one, and jaundice is a condition that your skin, where your skin turns yellow if you have some kind of a liver problem. And so that word icterus means yellow in color, and most of these birds, or a lot of them anyway, have some kind of yellow factor or yellow coloration to their plumage, and so that's why they got that name, the icterids. There's about 26 of them, different species that have been recorded in the United States, and about 16 of them have been recorded in Oregon. Today, we're going to just talk about 11. There are some that are really rare, that have only showed up a couple of times, and we'll mention a couple of real rare ones, but for the most part, we're going to be spending most of our time on the more common ones. The smallest icterid in the world is the orchard oriole, which is a little brown oriole that's found in the eastern part of the United States and migrates into Mexico and Central America. The largest of the icterids is the Amazonian Orapendula, which is nearly the size of a raven, bigger than the size of an American crow anyway. Excuse me. The Amazonian Orapendula is 30 times bigger than the orchard oriole, which sets up a gradient in this family, the icterids, where you have the biggest bird, the Amazonian Orapendula, and the smallest bird, the orchard oriole. The difference in size, that 30 times figure right there, is a figure that is unprecedented in other families in the birds of the Western Hemisphere anyway. So there's a bigger spread in the icterids between the biggest one and the smallest one than any other family. Most of them are omnivorous, and so they will eat, they'll eat seeds, they'll eat other vegetation, other vegetable matter. They often will prefer fruit because many of them have some sort of link to the tropics where there's quite a bit of fruit anyway. And one of the ways that you can attract some of these guys, and actually I got to tell you, in Oregon, probably this only works mostly for Orioles, mostly for the Bullock's Oriole. Put out a little bit of fruit, put out an orange half, take an orange and cut it in half, run a nail through it into a top of a fence post someplace, and you might get an Oriole that comes to those little fruit halves. Works pretty well down south. I haven't had that much luck with it here, but I'm still trying every year. In general, the icterid reproduction is they're fairly consistent with a couple of variations anyway on how they reproduce as far as the overall group goes. Most of them are colonial nesters. They'll nest in colonies. They'll nest in big groups. Their breeding types, some of them are monogamous. That means that they only have one mate. Some of them are polygynous or polygynous, and that means that they have that one male has many female mates. And some of them are polyandrous, which means that one female has many male mates. So they have a lot of different strategies for mating, but I want to point out that by far the most common strategy in the group is the polygynous or polygynous strategy, where one male develops a harem of several, from 2 to maybe as many as 13 or 15 females, and then he watches over those females and defends the territory within those that those females can nest in. And that's the most common breeding strategy for this group of birds. Both sexes tend to defend their territories, with the males doing more of the defense of the overall territory, and the females will spend a lot of time defending just around their own nests. The nest location is very variable within the group. It's a big group, but for the most part, they like to be somewhere on or near the ground, although a lot of them, probably close to half of them, I guess, would nest up in the trees. But they like to be near water. And the ones that do nest on the ground can build rather elaborate kind of little colonial ground nests, which is unusual for ground nesting birds. The nest builder is the female for the most part. The males sometimes will help, but I don't think there are any of the 11 species that we're going to talk about that the male builds the nest for the female. The female is the nest builder. The nest type is typically a little nest bowl, or oftentimes within the family anyway, it's sort of a dangling sock-like nest that hangs from a branch. In the case of the big Oropendulas, the ones that are the size of ravens, that sock-like nest might be 4 or 5 feet long and dangling off of a big fig tree or something in the tropics. It's very impressive. Nest reuse doesn't exist for the most part. If the bird's going to double clutch, let's say they raised a group of young, that young fledged or maybe even died, they want to go for round 2, then they'll start over and rebuild the nest. They don't usually use the nest more than once. I want you to pay close attention. We're about done with just boring stuff. We're getting to pictures pretty soon for those of us that need to have pictures. But the 2 numbers that I want you to pay close attention to are the incubation numbers of 10 to 13 days and the fledged date of 10 to 13 days. And the reason I want to do that is because the number 10 to 13 is pretty close to 14. And 14 is a 2-week period, which is the way I remember this, is that the icterids, for the most part, as a group, spend about 2 weeks, about 14 days incubating their eggs, and they spend about 2 weeks, about 14 days feeding the young and raising the young before they fledge out of the nest. So it's a nice, easy term to remember for, and it's the same with maybe a 1 or 2 day difference between the little orchard oriole that's the size of a sparrow and the Oropendula, which is the size of a crow. So within the group, they're fairly consistent. It takes about 2 or 3 weeks to build the nest and to court and to get things established where you have territory set up. And then it takes and then mating occurs. Then it takes about 2 weeks for the females to sit on the nest and incubate the eggs. And then the eggs hatch. And when the eggs hatch, the babies are blind, they're naked, they're unable to feed themselves. They're what we call altricial babies. And these guys, as opposed to the opposite, would be like a baby pheasant can get up and feed itself and run around within an hour of hatching out of the egg. That would be a bird called a precocial bird. Altricial birds are blind and naked and unable to feed themselves. And these guys then depend on the parents to feed them until they can become old enough and grow enough feathers to be able to get out of the nest on their own. And then after that, then they fledge. And that process of going from hatching to fledging takes about 2 weeks. So that's the whole breeding process, and it's relatively consistent throughout the group. And so that's why I wanted to point out those numbers. It's easy to remember if you're wondering how long are those blackbirds going to be in the marsh behind my house. Well, then that gives you a little bit of an idea. It takes about a month to get to the nesting site and set up territories and finally find a mate and do all that stuff. And then it takes about a month to make babies. So we're talking about a 2-month process here to get blackbirds to produce their young. Here, what I did was gather a few pictures that I've taken. Most of these are mine, 2 of them are not. But a couple of pictures of some icterids that I took in the tropics. In the upper left-hand corner is a yellow-winged cacique that's taken in Mexico. In the top center picture is an orchard oriole. There are actually records in Oregon of orchard oriole, but I've not ever seen one in Oregon. The upper right-hand bird is a Montezuma oripendula. It's a big bird, about the size of our crow, pretty close. And then bottom left looks like an oriole, but it's actually a bird called a troupiole. And this is a Venezuelan troupiole, very colorful one. That's not my picture because I've never actually seen that bird. And the bottom center picture is a black cowled oriole found in right near San Blas, Mexico, where that picture was taken. And then the bottom right picture is a bronze cowbird, and that's not my picture either because I can't take a picture that good. That's the way it goes. So just a sample of some of the tropical icterids that are out there. There are a lot of, remember, about 100 different species of different kinds of icterids. We're going to take a look at the 11 that are found in Oregon, and that would be these 11 right here. Now, these are all my pictures, and I have to tell you, it took me a long time to get them all to line up like that. It's very, very tough to train those birds to do that, but finally got it done. That was pretty good. So here we have a couple of birds in flight. That's an oriole, a Bullock's oriole in the upper left, and a bobolink in the upper right in flight. On the sprinkler pipe itself, starting from the left, is a tricolor blackbird, a brewer's blackbird, a cowbird, a brown-headed cowbird, a common grackle, then a red-winged blackbird, then a western meadowlark, then a yellow-headed blackbird. Then the big bird at the bottom is a great-tailed grackle, and the small bird at the bottom is a rusty blackbird. So these are the 11 that we're going to talk about because they're the 11 that I've seen in Central Oregon and that have been seen a few times in Central Oregon anyway, at least. I will split this group into 2, into the more common birds that we see every year, and then some of the rarer birds that we don't see every year as we go through them. And we'll just talk a little bit about each one. We're going to go right into the blackbirds. I'm glancing up at the clock and my wife is waving at me. She's saying we're already behind, which is typical for me. So be patient and bear with me. We're going to start with the brewer's blackbird. And the brewer's blackbird is one of our more common birds and one of the easiest birds to identify for most people because it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And here we have a brewer's blackbird that's on the left, the male. And the male from a distance, looks like just an all black bird with a yellow eye. But the reality is, if you can get a little bit close on a sunny day, you can see that it has a purplish hue to the top portion of the body up around the head and the neck. And then it also has a little bit of greenish hue to the body if the light's just right. It has, looking at the female over here, she's much different color. Remember, we have that sexual dimorphism that we talked about. The females are going to be different than the males in almost every species we talk about today. But one of the things that the female has is about the same form as the male. She has, notice her bill is kind of long for a bird that size, and her tail sticks out quite a ways. At the very least, she doesn't have a short bill and a short tail anyway, which is what we're going to use a little bit later on to help separate this bird from one of the birds that are pretty similar to it. Down at the bottom, we mentioned that there is difference between the males and the females. Gives you a little bit of data about what we're talking about. We're not talking about dramatic differences in size. For example, a male blackbird will be 21 and 25 centimeters. The female just a little bit smaller than that. And then the mass is about, the male is about 67 grams, a female about 58 grams. But consistently, the females are a little bit smaller than the males. I just picked some Brewer's Blackbirds photos to show you again what we're looking for. Pretty much a solid blackbird with a yellow eye on the male. There's about 4 different kind of males for us to look for here. And then there's one I shot just the other day, which I thought was kind of a cool picture with the black background. Blends in pretty well. And then we get to the females, which are problematic. I probably get as many questions about when people send me as many pictures of this bird and say, what bird is this? Than almost anything else I get, because it's sort of a nondescript little gray bird, and there are a couple of possibilities that it could be, and so people get confused about it. But again, what we want to do is look for this bird to be kind of long on both ends. It has kind of a longer tail, has a longer bill. It's kind of a little brown or gray kind of a bird, so it doesn't have a lot of striping and specific details or field marks to look for, but we're looking for that long tail and long bill. And something I can't stress enough is to continually look around and look and see if you can find some males that are going to be with this, because the males are just that much easier to identify. A couple birds that you might mistake for Brewer's Blackbirds. The upper left, look at those 2 birds right there. You wouldn't think you'd ever mistake them for anything, but the reality is those are 2 birds in pretty bright light. They don't look like that all the time, but common grackles are often mistaken for Brewer's Blackbirds. They can look very similar in dull light, especially. Common grackles, though, are bigger than Brewer's Blackbirds. Both of them are more colorful than the Brewer's Blackbirds. And both of them have longer tails that are sort of wedge shaped and almost like the bottom of a boat, like it would collect a little bit of water. Can't see that too well in either one of these photos, but that's what's a common characteristic of the grackles. And both these birds, the common grackle, male and female, are both pretty rare in Central Oregon. What's not rare in Central Oregon is the brown-headed cowbird down at the bottom. And especially the male on the right is pretty easy to identify because he has a brown head, so he doesn't get confused with Brewer's Blackbirds very often, although there are times when Brewer's Blackbirds can be brown, and there are times when they can be gray, and then there are times when they can be brown and gray. And if they're brown around the head and gray on the body, then people mistake them for cowbirds quite often. I like to identify cowbirds by shape better than color. If you look at our bird here on the left, the female brown-headed cowbird, she has what we call a Roman nose. If you took a string and put it on the end of the bill and ran that string to the top of the forehead, that string would be almost straight, because there's a straight line between the nose essentially and to the top of the head, and we call that a Roman nose. The Brewer's Blackbird's not like that at all. It has a nice rounded head. And so the other thing that's very easy to pick out, if you look at the female cowbird here, the female cowbird has a pretty short stubby bill compared to a Brewer's Blackbird, and the tail is pretty short too compared to Brewer's Blackbird. So short on both ends for the cowbirds, long on both ends for the Brewer's Blackbirds. A couple facts about Brewer's Blackbirds. Their scientific name is Euphagus cyanocephalus, which means Euphagus means it's a good eater. Cyanocephalus means it's blue-headed, which refers to the blue sheen or purple sheen on its head. It's a pretty abundant bird, but it's in a pretty steep decline, alarming decline, really, since 1966. Anyway, when you look at those numbers between now or between at least 2016 and 1966, a 69% decline. And you go, well, wait a minute, you should be able to see that if you're having such a steep decline. But there are so many Brewer's blackbirds out there that even almost 3/4 of them have been decimated in the last 50 years. And I didn't really notice it very much. You can kind of see it now, I think, compared to when I first started birding, but I didn't have any idea that there was that kind of a decline. And if that continues over time, then even the Brewer's blackbird, a bird that's so abundant, may one day leave us, which would be pretty sad. They often, the Brewer's blackbirds often join other blackbirds and other starlings in very large feeding flocks in the wintertime. One of the interesting things is to look and see how human activities can affect bird behavior and bird distribution, especially. An example of this can be seen in the Brewer's blackbird. In the Brewer's blackbird, before 1914, the Brewer's blackbird wasn't found west of Minnesota, which is pretty wild. It wasn't found in the West at all. And today it's mostly a Western bird. And what's happened is that as people moved across the continent and changed the landscape by their activities, especially farming activities, then that brought habitat for those Brewer's blackbirds to spread out. And even though at the same time their population was probably being decimated a bit, the overall range had a chance to expand. And that range now extends all the way over to the West Coast. I'm going to zoom in here to the next thing here. I don't know if one of the things I put a couple of sounds on here. We'll try to play them. Raise your hand if you can hear this. Oh, never mind. We'll do the next one. I don't think you can hear that because there isn't anything to hear. Here's a little quick look at the range maps for Brewer's blackbird. Today's range maps are much different than they were 100 years ago, for sure. But for the most part, over on the left-hand side, where Oregon is, it's in the purple, and that means that we have them year-round. And if you look at the map over on the Oregon map over on the right, there's pretty much not any place in Oregon where you're going to go where you would pretty routinely find Brewer's blackbird. So that's a pretty easy bird to find. Next bird is the red-winged blackbird. Red-winged blackbird is a pretty easy bird to identify. It has a reddish colored wing, what we call an epaulette. An epaulette is sort of a patch that you have on your shoulder. That's people in the military have little epaulettes on their shoulders to show their rank. My forgiveness to the people in the military if that's incorrect, but that's my impression. Anyway, its epaulettes are shoulder patches anyway, and these guys have a shoulder patch that consists of, at first glance, a red patch that's bordered by yellow on the bottom. But I would like you to look at that color a little bit more closely and see if this makes sense to you. The patch that's typical for most red-winged blackbirds, that reddish color is actually more of an orange than red. It's at least an orangey red, if that makes any sense. There are orange tones to that red. And that's going to become important here in just a little bit when we talk about the next species. The next thing is that underneath that orangey red patch is a yellow patch. It's not a white patch, it's a yellow patch. And that becomes important as well. So the males have a yellow and orangey red patch on their wing, on their shoulder, and the rest of the bird is pretty much black. It's a little glossy black, but not as glossy as some of the other ones we're going to take a look at. The female is the most interesting in this species because the female is actually going to help us identify and separate the red-winged blackbird from the tricolored blackbird, which is a little bit harder to identify. The female here is a heavily streaked bird that often has an orange or yellowish wash to the face. Sometimes even reddish colored to the facial feathers, but that's highly individual. Some don't have any wash at all, but all of them are highly streaked like this, and they're fairly pale, so that you can easily see the streaks from the dark feathers from the light feathers. It looks like salt and pepper in the streaking. But more importantly, the streaking on the left-hand side goes all the way from the throat all the way down to the vent. So all the way to the base of the tail, you can see stripes on this bird. That's going to be really important because that's going to help us separate the female tricolored blackbirds from the female red-winged blackbirds. Once again, very striped bird that's very pale in the white feathers, dark in the darker feathers. So it gives you this salt and pepper looking streaked appearance with a little bit of wash of some kind of color in the face. That's the female. Here's some males. And the two males on the bottom are very nicely showing us their epaulets. And again, that color is not blood red, but sort of a reddish orangey color, and it fades into a little bit of yellow creamy color on the bottom, on those two birds on the bottom. That's relatively easy. Often, though, you'll see birds, especially in the wintertime, when the birds aren't displaying at all, where they will cover that epaulet quite a bit, sometimes all the way. So that makes it difficult to tell the difference between red wings and tricolors. I usually don't try to identify them to species if I can't see a good portion of the epaulet. Some people do, though. Some people are confident that they can tell by the shape of the bill and how shiny the bird is, and that's just a little bit harder, above my pay grade, I guess. I'm not that confident to do it, but some people can do it for sure. So here's 4 males anyway. But if you look at the 2 on the top, even though you can't see the epaulet very well, you can see parts of the epaulet. And you can see a little bit on the bird on the left in the upper left-hand corner. You can see a little bit of color there. And you can see that maybe you can't tell what the red color is, but you can tell that the color below the red is yellow or orange anyway. And it's definitely not white. It's some other color. And so that's going to tell you if it's not white, it's not tricolor. It's going to be red-winged blackbird. Same with the bird on the right. Can't see any red hardly at all, but what you can see is that white, what's supposed to be yellow. And it looks yellow to me. It's certainly not white, and it needs to be white if it's going to be a tricolored blackbird. Here we have some females. Striking females. Some of them are, there's quite a bit of variability in female red-winged blackbirds. Some of them even have a little bit of an epaulet. You can see on the bottom right-hand bird, there's a little bit of reddish feathers going on in that shoulder area, which almost makes you think that maybe there's an epaulet going on there, or a little bit of it. But essentially, we're going to ignore all that pretty well in 3 of these birds. There's not much color in the upper right-hand bird in the face, but what you can see are those stripes in the chest area, and notice that those stripes go all the way down the belly to where the transition between the chest and the belly, and continue to go. You can still see stripes all the way to the base of the tail, or the area we call the vent, down there where the tail meets the body. So we can see stripes all the way on the front part of this bird. And that will become dramatic here in just a second when we take a look at tricolored blackbirds. Okay, that's the females. Similar birds, tricolored males are glossier. They have a pointier bill. That's the bill sharper than the red-winged blackbird. All that's pretty hard to tell. Instead, let's concentrate on epaulet. Look at that picture on the left. This bird does not have an orange epaulet. That's not orange. That's blood red. And it indicates that this is a tricolored blackbird, and that's one of the big differences. We're looking for that color of red, not just that it's red, but what color of red. And then to top it off, if you can get a good look at the white lining at the bottom of the red, if it's blood red with white lining, that's a tricolored blackbird. If this was going to be a red-winged blackbird, it would be orange red on the top and yellow on the bottom. The female tricolored blackbirds are much darker, and they don't have any white streaking on the belly portion of the bird. It's not a great picture in the center here of a female tricolored blackbird because it doesn't show the stripes on the chest very well. But you can clearly see the belly of this bird, and there's no white striping. So that's what we're going to be looking for to separate the tricoloreds from females from the males. And then sometimes, you know, these little streaky sparrows can fool us into thinking that maybe they're female red-winged blackbirds, because female red-winged blackbirds are streaky. But sparrows have much smaller bills in proportion to their head than the brewer's blackbirds do. The red-winged blackbirds. So with a little bit of work, you can separate those guys out pretty easily just by size. The scientific name for the red-winged blackbird is Agelaius phoenicius. which means the Agelaius refers to the bird living in flocks, and Phoenicius refers to the color red. So this bird has a red wing, and it's a bird that exists in big flocks. And as you'll see, some of the flocks are huge. This bird was named by Linnaeus himself. If you don't know who Linnaeus is, he's the guy that came up with the system of naming, of giving scientific names and actually different levels of names to all the living things on the planet. So when you see that long list of kingdom and phylum and class and order and family and genus and species, then that was all developed by Linnaeus himself. We used the last two of those Latin names for the scientific name, Agelaius phoenicius. Generally considered to be a marsh bird, but red-winged blackbirds can nest in a lot of different places. They need some place to build a nest around a batch of grass, so they can surprise you sometimes. But they're incredibly abundant across the continent. They're a species whose population has reduced, has dropped almost 50% in the last 50 plus years. And yet we're not terribly concerned about them compared to other birds because there's so many of them to start with that we have bigger fish to fry and other bigger concerns than, even though they're a 50% loss in 50 years is alarming in any respect. It's not as alarming as some of the other problems that we have. These birds, along with a lot of the other icterids, roost at night in big giant groups. The red-winged blackbirds often will do this in a marsh, but they'll sometimes do it in trees too. And if your tree happens to be in your front yard, they don't just sleep at night. They spend the entire time bickering with each other. And so it can be quite a noise for sure. In California, there is a subspecies of red-winged blackbird that doesn't have the yellow band at the bottom, just a red patch. And it's called a bicolored blackbird. And I have seen one little group of bicolored blackbirds before, but they're in a tiny portion of California. They're a pretty rare bird. Not one that we've ever had, I don't think, in Oregon anyway. And then red-winged blackbirds and brewer's blackbirds are pretty famous for attacking people and pets. And people, if you go on YouTube, there's a lot of videos. Just if you type in bird attacks human, it's usually an icterid. And it's usually a red wing or a brewer's blackbird. And that means that human or pet got too close to their nest or to their young, and they will they'll defend their nest and young quite dramatically. Let's see if you can hear this red-winged blackbird song. I don't think you can hear it, but let's try it. Bob, raise your hand if you can hear that song. Nope. Okay, I can hear it. For some reason it plays on my end, but it won't play on your end. So we'll forget about the songs. You guys can play those songs online if you want to see what the birds sound like. Here's some range maps for red-winged blackbird. And red-winged blackbirds found virtually over the entire continent and found virtually over the entire state as well. So very common bird, very abundant, but still in a bit of trouble in the sense that they can't sustain the kind of losses that they're having on an annual basis forever, because even a bird that abundant is going to disappear if you're losing the kind of numbers that we're losing these days. Now we're going to talk about tricolored blackbirds. And we've already mentioned quite a few of the field marks that separate the two, tricolored from red-winged blackbird. And that's really our only identification problem with these, I think. They're pretty easy to identify away from, especially the males anyway. But again, to review, the female on the left is a charcoal colored bird, darker colored than a red wing. She has faint streaking on the chest and the neck, but she has no streaking on the belly. That streaking is really there, but the belly feathers themselves are very dark in color, and they tend to hide those streaks. So that's a pretty good indicator that you have a tricolored female. The males has that epaulette, the shoulder patch. That shoulder patch is red and white instead of red and yellow, and the red is blood red. It's not orangey red like the red-winged blackbirds. The body itself is real glossy in shape or in color, and the bill is pointy, but those are sort of relative terms that are a little hard to keep in your head, and a little hard to identify if you're not really familiar with tricolored blackbirds. There are other things about tricolored blackbirds, by the way, that separate them from red-winged blackbirds. One of them is the length of a couple of the primary feathers. You can see that a little bit in this picture. If you look at the left wing and where it spreads out like fingers, some of those feathers that are sticking out the farthest there are the primary feathers. And some of those are a little longer in the tricolored blackbird than they are in red-winged blackbird, which gives the tricolored blackbird a pointier wing appearance when it flies. But I got to tell you got to see a lot of tricolored blackbirds before. I've looked for that before. And it's just, you just have to see a whole lot of them before you start seeing that. It's not the best thing to look for when you first start out, or if you're struggling to be able to tell the two apart. Stick with the shoulder patches, stick with the epaulets, and look for those colors, especially when the birds are flying. That's when you get the best look at them. Here's 4 tricolored blackbird males. All 4 of these were taken in the farmland north of Prineville. And I think, anyway, looks like it. And all we're looking at is those epaulets. And we look and see, do we have orange and yellow, or do we have blood red and white? And I think pretty clearly with all 4 of these, we have blood red and white. And so we're going to call those guys tricolored blackbirds. Here's our females. What's that? Yeah, thank you. Here we have our females, and the female tricolored blackbird is darker than the female red wing. I threw a little red wing blackbird over here on the left, bottom left, just to give you a comparison anyway. So look at her, and then look at these other 4 guys, or other 4 girls anyway. They're darker in color overall, but on the chest especially, they have a little bit of streaking. Sometimes it's even hard to see that streaking on the chest, they're so dark. But on the belly's almost black on these birds. And that makes it a little bit easier to pick out the tricolored females from the red-winged blackbird females. Not easy, a little bit of a challenge, not as easy as the males sometimes, especially in breeding season, but still, I think in winter, maybe a better way to tell tricolored blackbirds from red-winged blackbirds is to look at the females than the males. So similar species, it's going to be the opposite of what we did when we did the red-winged blackbirds. The similar species are the red-wings. So very quickly, we've already gone over this. The red-wings have orange and yellow on their epaulets in the upper left-hand picture. The center picture there, the females are streaky in both species, but the female red-winged blackbird is streaky both in the chest and on the belly, and it's more paler overall. And then, again, sometimes you could confuse dark sparrows, dark streaky sparrows with tricolored blackbirds, but look at that bill, and that bill is just not long enough to be a blackbird. If you compare the bill size with the bird at the bottom and the bird in the middle, it's just not the same thing. They're not the same kind of bird. The tricolored blackbird's Latin name is Agelaius tricolor, scientific name. And that means Agelaius again refers to the bird lives in flocks. Same genus, by the way, as the red-winged blackbird, close relative. Tricolor refers to the 3 different colors on the bird, red, white, and black. This used to be a much more abundant bird than it is now. In fact, early reports and early research done in the early 1900s suggested that maybe the tricolored blackbird was the most abundant land bird in California in the early 1900s. Since that time, though, back then they would find some large flocks of tricolored blackbirds that were 250,000 birds just in one flock, and they would find several of those large flocks like that. Today, there are fewer than 250,000 birds total in the world. And even though 99% of the birds, the tricolored blackbirds, live in California, there's still very few of them in California compared to what there was just 100 years ago. So another bird that's in trouble. Most of these icterids, by the way, are in trouble because we're either destroying their nesting habitat, or more often we're destroying the birds themselves because farmers don't like them because they feed on grains and things that the farmers want to keep for themselves. We can't blame farmers for doing that, but there's a conflict between farmers and the birds. And when we know from past experience, when there's a conflict between farmers and birds, then birds lose. That's kind of the way the world goes, I suppose. Let's see, I'm just looking at this thing, what we need to do. One of the things that's interesting is that, like I said, 99% of the tricolored blackbirds live in California, but there are a few of them that live in Oregon. And we're lucky enough to, in Crook County, to have a couple of pretty good flocks of tricolored blackbirds that do nest here. And that's very unusual in Oregon, as we'll see in the range map here in just a little bit. There are very few places where you can find tricolored blackbirds in Oregon. And even the places when you do find them, we're talking a lot of times just 20 birds or sometimes 100 birds. I think that sometimes we get close to 500 birds sometimes in Crook County. But that's a little hard to tell sometimes because they move around a little bit. But it raises some questions, and the questions are, first of all, genetically, are the Oregon birds any different than the California birds? That's a question that begs some kind of research anyway. And then the other question is, often the Oregon birds disappear for months at a time. And the question is, where do they go? Do they go to California? And if they do they mix in with all those California birds? And then sometimes we get a different mix that comes up from California. No one knows the answer to these questions. So lots of research needs to be done. One of the things that will happen probably next year is that Ken Hassagen and I are working on a tricolored blackbird project that we're going to try to kick in gear. I doubt that he and I will do the project. It's a project that needs a little bit more academic expertise than we have, but we're going to be a sort of the movers and shakers of a project that does some more research, testing, taking blood samples and banding and surveying tricolored blackbirds in the state of Oregon to get an idea of where they are, how many do we have, and then are they genetically different than the other birds? And we're going to be working on that a little starting next year, it looks like. That's going to take a lot of cooperation by local landowners, and sometimes that cooperation of local landowners is the biggest challenge of all. We'll see. Here's some quick maps over here. Look at the map on the left of the United States of North America, and you can see that almost all of the tricolored blackbirds in the world are confined to California, and a little smattering in the Klamath Basin, and then a little bit up where we live. They do go all the way up into Washington, by the way, but little tiny colonies, 10 to 100 birds, something like that. They forget the Oregon map over there because that's a little bit confusing. If you look at the bottom purple map, the purple map is an eBird map that shows actual birds that were found. It's a little bit misleading because this is a map that's confined to just the months of June and July. So this should be nesting birds. But a lot of these sightings from this map were actually just single birds or 1 or 2 birds or 3 birds. And the other problem with maps like this from eBird is that tricolored blackbird is one of the birds that's misidentified more than any other bird, more than most birds anyway on eBird. And so I'm not sure how accurate those maps are. We'll see. Next bird is the yellow-headed blackbird. And the yellow-headed blackbird on the left here, we have a female yellow-headed blackbird, and she has a little bit of yellow on the throat and the face, and she's brown in color. The yellow-headed blackbird male is black in color with a big white patch in the wing and yellow on the head. Every single year of my birding life, I think people have called me or emailed me and said, we've got this crazy black bird with a yellow head in our yard. What's it called? And I go, let's see, blackbird, yellow head, must be a yellow-headed blackbird. And they go, no, it can't be. Can't be that easy, but that's exactly what it is. It's difficult to confuse a male yellow-headed blackbird with anything else. Female, maybe. But even her, it's pretty easy, and they tend to travel together a little bit in migration anyway. So white in the wing for the male, yellow on the head, blackbird, you got a yellow-headed blackbird. Here's about 4 different kind of males. You'll notice the little pose that the male in the bottom right is doing. That's typical of not just the yellow-headed blackbirds, but the Icterids in general. They like that kind of a pose where they stick their bill in the air and they kind of display to other ones this bird, you can see why he might do it, because he's showing off that bright yellow breast that he has. But many of the icterids, even the oropendulas in the tropics, will take that pose and display to other oropendulas. Here's some females. Not all of females look exactly the same, but the general pattern of a brown body, yellow face, a little bit of yellow breast, that works for most of the yellow-headed blackbirds. Similar species to these guys, really there aren't very many. I picked a couple that somebody could maybe mistake for yellow-headed blackbirds, but the warblers are too small, way smaller than a yellow-headed blackbird. And the chat is just not found in the same kind of habitats typically as yellow-headed blackbirds are. So you're probably not going to make the mistake of having a problem distinguishing these guys. The Latin name for a yellow-headed blackbird is Xanthocephalus, which means the yellow-headed blackbird, or the yellow-headed yellowhead. It's the largest of Oregon's icterids, quite a bit bigger than the redwing and the brewer's blackbird that we've talked about before. It's almost a cattail bulrush obligate, meaning that you almost always see them nesting in cattails. And when they do, most of them migrate. They're maybe a little bit more migratory than some of the other birds. It's rare to find a yellow-headed blackbird in the wintertime here in Central Oregon. And when they do migrate down south for the winter, they tend to separate into male and female groups. The males stay on the northern edge of the wintering grounds, and the females go to the south, and they just don't hang out with each other very much in migration or on vacation. They're pretty abundant. Some of the big flocks in the south can reach well into the thousands. When you look at problems with predation and problems with other birds that compete with them, it turns out that one of the biggest problem birds for a yellow-headed blackbird is the little tiny marsh wren that's only about a fifth its size. And that little tiny marsh wren doesn't like to have other birds nesting close to it. So they will sort of stealthily go in and destroy the nests of other birds that are around. And it ends up being one of the biggest problems of nest failure in yellow-headed blackbirds is this little tiny marsh wren that you wouldn't think could hurt that big giant yellow-headed blackbird. These guys are like the other icterids. They're poisoned, they're shot, they're burned out, they're looked on as evil raiders by farmers and other people that depend on the land for their living. And it's a battle that they certainly have to fight every year. They do have a reputation as the world's worst bird song, and apparently my bird songs are not playing. I can hear mine right now, but you probably can't. Anyway, that's the world's worst bird song, and I encourage you to go online after this presentation and listen to yellow-headed blackbird bird song, because it's awful. It's worth the price of the time it takes to go find it, because it's just terrible. Yellow-headed blackbird range in the United States in the breeding season. It goes through the center part of the U.S. and Eastern Oregon. You don't find it in Western Oregon very often. Yellow-headed blackbird in Western Oregon and on the Oregon coast is a pretty rare bird. And then they migrate south down into Mexico and the southern United States. The oriole, I think, is our second to the last icterid. That's the common icterids that we have. Female oriole on the left here has a nice little wing patch that's variable in size. Sometimes it's big, sometimes it's little. That wing patch is not that important. What is important is if you look at the two ends of this bird on the left, the two ends are both yellow on the head and yellow on the tail, and then pale in the middle. That's going to be a good set of field marks for us to use to separate this oriole, female oriole, especially from other orioles. If you travel to the tropics where there are a lot of orioles, then that's a field mark that you definitely want to have in your back pocket when it comes to identifying Bullock's orioles, our local oriole here in the West, at least in Oregon anyway. The male has a orange and black body with a black line through the eye and a little black sort of beard, or a little black stripe from the lower mandible down to the throat. The body's orange, and then there's a big, big white patch, bigger than any other Oriole, I think, in at least in the most of the new world. Anyway, I'm not sure if there's any Orioles in the southern South America that have a white patch like that, because I'm not familiar with that area. But all of the Orioles that I've ever seen, anyway, the Bullock's Oriole has the most white in the wing right there. The male is pretty easy to identify. It's an orange and black bird with a big white patch in the wing. Female sometimes can fool you. It can just look like a mysterious little yellow bird. But if you keep in mind that it's yellow on both ends and pale in the middle, you can identify it pretty easily. Here are 4 males. Look at that white wing patch. You can see it in almost every bird here except for the bottom right. And even the bottom right, you can see the black line that goes through the eye and the black beard that it has through the throat. Female, yellow on both ends, white or pale. It's not always white, by the way. It's often gray in the middle rather than white. Birds that might confuse you might confuse an Oriole, or I mean a warbler with the female Oriole, but probably not. Warblers are much smaller than Orioles and much differently shaped. What you will have problem with often, though, is the female tanagers. And if you look at the female tanager here on the left, that female tanager has a color pattern that's pretty similar to the female Bullock's Oriole. Has some white in the wing. It actually has 2 white wing stripes, which is a little bit different than the Oriole. But this female tanager has a yellow head. It has some yellow, not necessarily in the tail, but in the vent area. So it can kind of fool you to think that there's some yellow on both ends. And then it has that gray or white in the middle sometimes. Sometimes the female tanagers are all different kinds of combinations of yellow colors, but sometimes they look like this one. They can really fool you. You have to go to the bird's bill if you find a bird that's confusing like this. And a tanager bill is much different looking bill than the Oriole bill. The Oriole bill is sharper and cleaner lines on it, so that's pointier. And this one's kind of a lumpy little, thicker, denser, more robust bill than the Orioles are. And so that's worth a look in your field guide to take a look in case you ever run into those guys. I'm going to skip this part right here. There's nothing really important here other than the fact that these guys do build a hanging nest that looks like a sock that hangs from a branch. And that sock nest tends to blend in pretty well in the summertime, so you don't see it very well. They like to feed and they like to nest in tall trees. And they like to nest in especially tall cottonwood kind of trees, cottonwood or dogwood or something like that, a big tree. But they will take a nest in smaller trees, like willows if they have to. But they generally nest somewhere near water. Again, we mentioned that you can put out some fruit halves to attract these guys. What works for a lot of people is they put out a half and half grape jelly and water mixture in just some kind of a little dish. And apparently they really like grape jelly. So that's something to think about for you to take a look at. As usual, I'm behind, so I'm going to go a little bit faster. We've got Western Meadowlarks, our next Icterid. And the Western Meadowlark is a bird, if you look at it from the back in the upper left-hand corner, then it's a very camouflage-looking bird. But if you look at it from the front, like the bird on the right, it's a very bright-colored bird. And you can actually see these guys when they sit on a fence post or sit on a wire. When they see you as a potential predator, then they will often turn their back to you. So instead of looking at the real beautiful part, you're looking at the sort of ugly blended in part, camouflage part. So they're beautiful on the front, camouflage on the back. If you look at the bird in flight there, they have a little bit of white in the tail, and the tail is very short compared to most of the other Icterids. Also different than most of the other Icterids is that the males and the females are virtually the same size and virtually the same color. There may be some differences between the male and the female as far as shade and degree go, but for the most part, they're pretty much the same looking birds anyway, enough to where it's a little bit difficult to tell them apart. So we don't have to worry about that. Males from females, it won't matter. They'll look pretty much the same. You don't see the females very often anyway, because the females don't sit up and display like the males do. They don't need to. Again, you might confuse them with some of the yellow birds like warblers and tanagers, but most people know what a meadowlark is, and it's pretty easy to do. The meadowlark is the Oregon state bird. It's another bird whose populations continue to drop, especially in Western Oregon. In Western Oregon, the population has alarmingly dropped. You know, they made this the Oregon state bird when at a time when the bird was relatively common in the Willamette Valley. Now there's a political conundrum, and that is you have an Oregon state bird that's almost completely disappearing from the part of the state that has the most people in it. And so the question is, do you keep this a state bird if it's a bird that doesn't exist in the part of the state where most of the people are? And I would say yes, and most people would say yes, but some people say no. It's a problem. Here you can see that the range in Oregon for the Western meadowlark. Western meadowlark is a pretty widespread bird across the continent, but in Oregon, you won't find it in the high mountains. You find it a little bit in the Willamette Valley. Probably this map of Oregon is a little bit outdated, because I think the range of the Western meadowlark is probably reduced a little bit more on the Willamette Valley than it shows in this map. Last bird, the last common bird that we have is the brown-headed cowbird. And the brown-headed cowbird is different from most of the other icterids in a lot of different ways. It's the smallest of our icterid, normal icterids that we get here. And the female brown-headed cowbird's on the left there. And the problem with this bird is that it looks a lot like a sparrow, and it confuses people with a lot of people, and they think it's a sparrow. And I mentioned before that a lot of people misidentify tricolored blackbirds. Well, more people misidentify female cowbirds than they do the sparrow or the tricolored blackbird. I mean, the bird looks a little bit like a sparrow because it has that low forehead and it has that very short bill and very short tail. So it doesn't look like a blackbird. Now, if you look at the male, it clearly looks like a blackbird with a brown head, pretty easy, brown-headed cowbird. But the bird on the left, the female, causes some real problems. We'll show you that when we get to comparing it with some other birds. Brown-headed cowbird male, not too bad, not too hard for people to separate, has a pretty distinctive song. You don't see these two together very often, although sometimes in the wintertime, you can find early winter or late winter, you can find some cowbirds that still hang around, and the males and the females will mix together. They come together in the summertime to mate, obviously, but they don't hang with each other all that much in the summertime. Here's the female again, and I'll just draw your attention to the birds in the bottom right-hand corner. You can see the difference between males and females quite easily there. And then look at the other two birds on the left-hand side. Draw a line from the end of the bill to the top of the forehead. That, if you took a string and stretched it from the bill to the forehead, that string would be relatively straight. And that makes it different than some of the other birds you might confuse it with. That Roman nose is what helps me a lot anyway. Most of you know that cowbirds are what we call brood parasites, which are birds that lay their eggs in other birds' nests instead of raising their own young. And the birds that hatch in those nests tend to hatch a little earlier than the other eggs, and they tend to lay their eggs in host species that are smaller than the cowbirds are. And so when the babies all hatch, the cowbird babies are much bigger than the other babies, and he gets all the food, and the other ones either starve to death, or sometimes he will even kick the babies out of the nest. So it can be a real a problem for some of the smaller birds, especially warblers, who are over a long period of time being victimized by these brown-headed cowbirds. Now, brown-headed cowbird's been around for a long time, long before humans got here and manipulated the environment by logging and farming and doing all the things that they do. But before humans came, the other species that lived with cowbirds were restricted mostly to the open plains. Those species had developed ways of dealing with the cowbirds, and either not allowing them to enter their nests or taking steps after they did enter the nest to where it doesn't destroy their broods. But when the humans got here, when the white humans got here and opened up the countryside, that's allowed the cowbirds to spread and opened up to new populations like warblers that have no defenses against them. I'm not going to do that. Not going to do that. I kind of summarized that what I just said. Here's a couple of range maps for the brown-headed cowbird, and the one on the left shows you that you can find them pretty much everywhere. We were in North Carolina last year. They're brown-headed cowbirds everywhere. And then if you look at the eBird map on the right, they're thick throughout Oregon in the summertime. We're going to take about a 5-minute look at some rare icterids. Here's a couple of blackbirds. There's a male on the left, female on the right. Kind of odd looking ducks for sure. Not sure, at least one of them is an odd looking duck. The other one's not bad. But let's take a look at some of these rare icterids. Here's a bobolink. Now we do have bobolinks in Crook County. There's a population of bobolinks clear out by Paulina, and we'll probably take a field trip or two out to Paulina this year and see if we can find these bobolinks. It's going to be very interesting this year, though, because last year the bobolinks did not nest for the first time since we found them. Well, I will tell you that there are people that have told me that bobolinks have been nesting in that area near Paulina for generations, clear back into the early 1900s, I think, and probably long before that. But I'm not sure they're going to nest there now, because the big mystery is what will happen, because last year they got run out of there because there was such a drought last year. There was no place for them to nest. They had to leave. And so when we checked on the bobolinks last year in July, I checked on them 2 times and I didn't find any birds at all. The question is, will they come back? And will there be anything here when they do? We're not sure if they're not going to have another big drought this year. But these birds right here can be found in eastern Crook County. Just 1 or 2 good populations of breeding birds. So it's not very easy. You can find more of them in eastern Oregon. Here's the male. The male is a blackbird with a cream colored patch on the back of the head and some big white patches on its back. Just a gorgeous bird. If you haven't seen this bird, it's got to be on your bucket list. Bobolink in Oregon. This is what the female looks like. It's also what the juvenile looks like. It's also what the male looks like after he gets done breeding, and they raise the young and fledge the young. Then the males and the females will molt. Unlike most icterids molt just once a year. The bobolinks molt twice. They molt once in about 1st of August, and the males will look just like this female right here. And then they will leave Central Oregon and fly all the way down. It's like 18,000 miles or something to fly all the way down to southern South America, spend the winter down there, and then come back here and spend the breeding season again. They do that every year. So a real long distance migrant. It's interesting because they molt again before they migrate from Argentina back up to here. They will molt again. And they'll look the second time they molt, they don't molt into that breeding plumage. They molt into a yellow plumage, just like this one, the males I'm talking about. And then they start flying north. And as they do that, their feathers begin to wear, and the yellow tips of the feathers wear off. And the color you see, this black and white color right here, is actually underneath a bunch of yellow feathers. Those yellow feathers wear away and then reveal the black and white feathers underneath. 12,500 miles on that migration for the bobolink. Here's, here's an eBird map on the right to give you an idea of where you might find these birds in Oregon. And again, that big purple square to just above and to the right of the N in the word Oregon is where the birds are in eastern Crook County. There's a little purple spot in Bend, but that's just one bird, not a colony of birds. And then you can look at the map over on the left and see where you find most bobolinks. Most of them are found in the eastern United States in the summertime, and then they migrate down into South America in the wintertime. our winter time anyway. Lastly, we have a couple of birds called grackles. We actually have 3 birds to go here. I'll go pretty quickly. The common grackle is this bird right here. In Deschutes County, there are 7 records. In 92, there were 2 different birds found, 96, 04, 05, 19, and 21. And Crook County has had 1 record only, ever. A bird found in Powell Butte, not too far from my house, actually. So we do get common grackles every once in a while. It's one to watch for sure. And again, yellow-eyed like a brewer's blackbird, but much more colorful, a little bit bigger, and a longer tail. That tail sometimes folds into kind of a boat. Common grackle. Here's what the female looks. Female looks like a little warmer version of the male, a little warmer brown. And then we have the great-tailed grackle, which looks like a common grackle, only bigger and longer tailed and longer billed. In Deschutes County, there are 9 different records. As recently as last year, we had a bird in Deschutes County. Crook County's had 2 records, and Jefferson County's had 3. And here's a couple of male great-tailed grackles. If you've been to the tropics, you've probably seen this bird. It's a pretty common bird in Mexico for sure. Too bad you can't hear that sound if you can't hear it. Here's some female great-tailed grackles. And then finally, our last bird of the day is the rusty blackbird. And rusty blackbird is kind of a brown-colored blackbird that has a lot of gold flecks and kind of yellowish tones to it. Nice stripe above the eye, and the eye is set off with like a black semicircle underneath it. Deschutes County's had 5 records, including 1 from just this last winter, just a couple of months ago. And Crook County has yet to have a rusty blackbird, but maybe someday. Jefferson County's had 1. Judy Meredith, I think, found 1 just this last year in Jefferson County. A couple more things to mention before we go. There are other kinds of birds that you might find here. These are all birds that have been seen in Oregon. In Central Oregon, we have had Baltimore oriole, we have had orchard oriole and hooded oriole. I don't think we've had Scots or streakback, but these birds have been seen in Oregon. So these are possibilities of things to come. And one last thing to look for before you give up on the Icterids is remember that they do a lot of molting. They molt, most of them once a year. And if you happen to find a bird that is in mid-molt, it can look very odd, and you might think it's a different kind of bird, different species. But remember, if you can find one that's got blotchy dark feathers and blotchy white lighter feathers, it's probably a bird molting. And here are 3 different birds: a cowbird, a brewer's blackbird, and a great-tailed grackle that are all in the process of molting their feathers. And that's the end of my presentation. Let me stop this thing. And go ahead and open your mics if you're still awake and you have a question for me. If you don't, then we will call it a day. Sorry about going a little bit long there, but I never can do it under an hour. It never works.
Just right.
It's not too much over an hour after you consider we talked a little bit about Prineville Bird Club and that kind of thing, but we didn't get started until about 20 after, so not too bad. Any questions about blackbirds? Migration, breeding practices?
You did a good job, Chuck.
Oh, yeah, well, it's, I think, a real interesting topic. You know, when I first, sometimes when we do these programs, I've been doing the Prineville Bird Club programs now for, I don't know how many years, 7, 8, or 9, or 10 years, I don't even know. But we're, you know, I'm running out of families of birds that I've never talked about, but up until today, I've never really talked about the blackbirds as a family. So it was fun for me to go and do some research and get that organized and get it straightened out in my head as well. I think it'll be fun for most of you guys because a lot of people on this list that I see, a lot of people Ron Halverson said I totally ruined the Beatles song for him. Well, Ron, I got to tell you, I was going to sing it. That would have made it a lot worse, trust me. But anyway, I don't know what I was talking about before, but it was a lot of fun going through and learning some of that stuff. I know what I was going to say. I think when you guys, some of you will probably try to do some tricolor blackbird identification this year. And when you get to looking at those females and you look at that black belly versus that streaked breast on them, I think that set of field marks, it's not one you find very often in the field guides, but it is one that I picked up from one of the tricolored research websites in California. And when I went back and looked at my tricolored pictures, you could clearly see that that's a great field mark separating the female trikes from the female red-winged blackbirds. Okay. Anybody else? Mary Jane says, applause, applause. Yay. I'll pat myself on the back. Okay, gang. So what will happen is that I have recorded this program and I will release that recording. They usually take a day or two to send it to me. And then I'll release a link. There's a lot of information here. So it might be something that you might want to go back through if you're going to go out and do a blackbird hunt one of these days. It might be something you can go back through and look at slower. But I will send you the link to that thing and with a little bit of instructions to it on how to mess with it. And it'll be, I think, on YouTube, I think is the way they publish it. So it's pretty easy to take a look at. And beyond that, if there are no other questions,
Quick
I guess I
question.
will. Okay, question.
So do you have any tips on where we might look for tricoloreds nesting this summer?
Yeah, good question. I have to tell you that I had a slide for every one of the blackbirds with sites shown so that you could go and look for them. But then when I did a practice run on this thing, it took 3.5 hours to do the program. So I had to cut some stuff out. So that was one of the things that I cut out was the places to find them. But anyway, yeah, so the best place to look for tricolored blackbird by far is Crook County. Crook County in Central Oregon, well over 90% of the birds, tricolored blackbirds, are going to be found in Crook County. There are a smattering of tricolored blackbirds that we find in Deschutes County, but it's a pretty rare bird in Deschutes County. There may be a good chunk of birds in Jefferson County, but there's just not a lot of people out there looking. Last year, we did find a really nice nesting location. It's not great because it doesn't have very good parking, but it is great in that the birds are pretty close to the road, so you can see and hear them. And that's a place just a little bit north of Metolius. But beyond that place and beyond there's a feedlot or two feedlots in Jefferson County north of Madras, one north of Madras, one south of Madras, that also have shown that they can have at least wintering populations of tricolored blackbirds. But in Crook County this summer, if you wanted to go find them, you're going to need to listen to COBOL and check COBOL fairly frequently because they move around. Every year they will pick, I won't say they'll pick a different spot every year because the last 3 years they've nested in the same spot. But before that, almost year to year to year, they would switch to a different spot. And a part of that probably has to do with water levels being different every year. But there really isn't any way other than to wait for people to get into Crook County and find the breeding populations. Now in Northern California, the birds begin breeding in April, but here they don't. Here they don't begin breeding until May. So, somewhere around May, start listening to COBOL or just email me. Excuse me, nearly choked there. Just email me and I'll help you out because I usually know where they are. They do a lot of bouncing around early in the mating season. You think they're gonna nest at one place and they'll be there for 2 weeks and you think that's gotta be it. And then you go back one day and they're all gone. Then you have to go find them again and see where they went. So I can't tell you where they're gonna be because they're not the same place every year. If you are a person who's a photographer and you want to get the very best looks at yellow-headed blackbirds that you can possibly get and photograph yellow-headed blackbirds, drop me an email. I have a secret spot that's on some private land that you can drive right up to, and the birds are 10 feet away from you, right outside the window, and they're just gorgeous. And so as long as we go in one car, one photographer at a time, we can do that without disrupting the birds. And they're right along a road that has cars on it anyway, so they don't seem to be bothered by it at all. Let me know. Okay, thanks, guys. If you have any other questions, if you think of a question an hour from now, just drop me an email. Most of you have my email address. It was great seeing some of you guys. It's going to be awesome next month to be able to see some of the Prineville Bird Clubbers again. And again, everybody's welcome to come to those Prineville Bird Club meetings. There are no dues and no bylaws. There's no rules other than you have to be nice to the fat guy with white hair in the front of the room. That's the only rule. So I hope to see you guys, some of you there. Great seeing the Gurkeys. Haven't seen those guys in a while. And see you, Cindy and Ron and Jim and Bob and all you other folks out there. Thanks for joining us today. Judy, glad I got to see everybody today. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.